Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favour, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally by thy mercy attain everlasting life. Amen. Well, is the Opposition House Leader on his feet?
Speaker, I ask leave to make a personal statement.
Leader of the Opposition's asked leave for personal statements. Leave granted. I recognize Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you well know, the tone and tenor of this place is not always what it should be and what people expect from us. My duty as Leader of the Opposition is to elevate that tone, not lower it. Yesterday I failed in that duty, and I apologize to you, to the members opposite, members on this side, and most importantly, to the people of Saskatchewan who expect and deserve better, and I vow to do better in the future.
Thanks for that. Presenting petitions. Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People in Regina have been calling for justice for Samuel Uko, a young black man who died by suicide in Wascana Lake on May 21st of this year. Regina's African community is grieving. Mental health advocates are grieving. Samuel's family is grieving and deserves answers, Mr. Speaker. Samuel did all the right things that day to get the help he needed. He called 911, he spoke to a mental health professional and disclosed his thoughts of suicide. He begged for help on social media. He went to hospital twice. The second time, he was turned away. The system failed Samuel Uko. He's not the first person in Saskatchewan to seek help in a mental health emergency and not get the help he needed. But we can and must make sure it's the last. Today, will the Premier commit to an inquest into the death of Samuel Uko?
I recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite for this question on a very important point and of this individual, Samuel Uko, who did pass away here recently. And I just extend all of our condolences and all of our thoughts and prayers to the family and the friends of this young gentleman that passed far too soon. Mr. Speaker, with respect to an inquest, I've spoken in this House before and outside of it that the coroner is conducting his investigation. At the conclusion of that investigation, the coroner will decide, and it's fully within his purview if he should conduct a coroner's inquest at that point in time, and we would support whatever decision he would come to. Mr. Speaker, mental health and all too often subsequent addictions are a priority for this government. They're a priority for society and priority, I think, for the vast majority, if not all of the people across this province. And that's why we have invested heavily over the course of the last number of years. And we need to continue to do so, Mr. Speaker, because there is much more for us to do on this front, collectively. Not only in government, but collectively across the province in our communities. And we need to commit to not only providing the funding, Mr. Speaker, of which we are doing, but commit to also ensuring that funding is delivering on outcomes in our communities, Mr. Speaker. There's much more work to do here, and we need to work collectively to ensure that we are able to do that.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The family of Samuel Uko is calling for an inquest. It's fully within the Premier's authority to call on the Minister of Justice to make that happen. We know there are serious problems in what happened that day, and they reveal problems within the health system. Mr. Speaker, why is the Premier not using that authority and directing this to take place?
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question and thank the member for having raised the issue. Mr. Speaker, once again, we'd like to offer our sympathy and condolences to Samuel Uko's family. To lose a member under any circumstances is tragic, but under these circumstances, even more difficult for the family to go through. And for that, we certainly want to offer our sympathies and our condolences. Mr. Speaker, under our legislation, and under the practices that take place in our province, we don't make determinations about inquests on the floor of the legislature. These are done by an independent officer. They're made by the chief coroner. I am aware, Mr. Speaker, that the chief coroner is looking at this matter and looking at this case carefully. He will not make any kind of a decision until he has completed the investigation. SHA is also completing an investigation. A determination will be made in due course, and would urge the members opposite, as well as the families of Mr. Uko, to be patient and allow the process to play itself out as it should. If we try and do things out of turn or in an improper manner, that's when we have problems with things later on, and would urge the members opposite to be patient. We certainly understand their desire to move on with it.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government has failed Samuel Uko and the 2,200 others in the province who have died by suicide in the past 15 years. And our province's recently introduced suicide prevention strategy has been described by advocates as a travesty and as wholly inadequate to save lives. It simply doesn't meet the bill of what a suicide strategy must be, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow, the Premier has an opportunity to show leadership and take us in a different direction. My question for the Premier, tomorrow, when the opposition bill for a suicide prevention strategy comes to the floor, will he be voting in favour of the establishment of a suicide prevention plan for this province?
Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Mr. Speaker, suicide is definitely something that I believe has touched a lot of people in this province. When we lose a loved one, it affects families, it affects communities, and certainly affects the province, Mr. Speaker. Just want to remind people that when they have those iterations we have Healthline 811 out there, we have our Sask Health Authority continuing to provide mental health and addiction services in communities across Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. This plan was meant, it's an adaptable guide for future actions, Mr. Speaker. It's that point where we're engaging work that's already been done, we're acknowledging the work that's already been done, as well as engaging community leaders that have been responsible for some of the very successful projects like Roots for Hope, Mr. Speaker. Those are found in northern communities such as Buffalo Narrows, Meadow Lake, La Ronge, Mr. Speaker. This plan is meant to engage our stakeholders, our provincial stakeholders, and it's to continue that discussion that we need to have to continue to build on and work with our provincial partners, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The plan presented was described by advocates as, at best, a first draft, a complete failure to meet what is needed when it comes to addressing the suicide needs in the province, addressing the fact that we've lost 2,200 people in the past 15 years and we continue to lose people to suicide in the province. And the lack of a strategy and the lack of willingness to support a very reasonable bill for such strategy is a real missed opportunity for leadership on the part of the Premier, Mr. Speaker. Samuel Uko didn't get the care he needed when he needed it. Sadly, that happens a lot. Far too often, patients who arrive in a crisis in our emergency rooms do not get the help that they need. We've learned recently that just last year, patients admitted for mental health care at both Regina General and the Dubé Centre in Saskatoon were waiting an average of 13 hours to get a bed. Mr. Speaker, does the Premier think that people in an acute mental health crisis, in that frightening and dangerous moment, that they should be waiting over half a day to get support?
Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Mr. Speaker, as a continuation of our suicide plan, Mr. Speaker, we're using it to coordinate activities to promote life and reduce risk factors related to suicide in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, and that includes in our facilities. Part of the results of the plan is to support the auditor in identifying some of the risk factors and the needs in northwestern Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. So that's identified as part of our plan. Mr. Speaker, the input that went into this plan comes from a number of publications, reports, entities, professionals, Mr. Speaker. Just part of the bibliography includes the Government of Canada, Government of Saskatchewan, the First Nations Suicide First Nation Suicide Prevention Strategy, Mr. Speaker. The Mental Health Commission of Canada, Mr. Speaker, has written us a acknowledgement letter and thanking us for the plan, for coming up with the plan, and their comments were, the 5-pillar plan provides an adaptable starting point for the province to address identified needs and aligns with work already being done by community leaders, Mr. Speaker. That is what is in our plan.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A plan that's wholly inadequate to save lives, that does not have what it needs to change the reality in Saskatchewan, that when it comes to providing timely access to mental health care, this government just continues to let people down. 13 hours is far too long for someone in a crisis to wait. Too many people wind up leaving in that time and not getting the help they need, as they're not welcomed as they should be, as we know, with so many people in our province already stretched and stressed, and more people struggling today, that more people are going to need that help than even a few months ago. This government's failure to ensure quick, appropriate access to care is costing us lives. Does the Premier think that these long waits for care are acceptable? And why won't he commit, as we have as New Democrats, to establishing dedicated mental health emergency rooms so that people always get the care, the appropriate care, timely care they need and deserve?
Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Mr. Speaker, this government takes mental health very seriously, as indicated in our budget, Mr. Speaker. I believe we have a $33 million lift to mental health and addiction services, Mr. Speaker. $12 million targeted for mental health and addiction services. This is an increase of $19.3 million, Mr. Speaker. We have put extra funding into the SHNB facility, Mr. Speaker, as well as a number of facilities across the province that we've invested in to support mental health and addictions, Mr. Speaker. As part of the plan, we indicated a number of first-year actions that we want to ensure are taking place, Mr. Speaker. We've put over $1.25 million to ensure that these year-one actions are implemented. For instance, improving access to psychiatric consultations for patients accessing emergency rooms in the Northwest, something that the auditor had identified and we're certainly following up on, Mr. Speaker. Further expansion of our mental health first aid training across the province, across the human service sector and ministries, Mr. Speaker. We're expanding our use, monitoring suicide protocols, Mr. Speaker. These are year-one actions. We have many other actions we want to continue to follow up on, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon, Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the minister defended the choice to hand the crystal meth rehab project to an affiliate and for-profit company from BC without putting it to tender. He says it's a continuation of service, but let's be clear, this affiliate has no experience with substance abuse services in the province. This is the very first centre of its kind in Saskatchewan, and the choice to not have a competition makes no sense. Other companies with on-the-ground experience delivering addictions care had interest in this project and were shut out. Why was this deal simply handed to the out-of-province company that Grant Devine was lobbying for? Why wouldn't the minister want a competition to ensure we get this right?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's a number of facts I'd like to correct on the record. First of all, the member said that the government handed it to an out-of-province company. That's not the case, Mr. Speaker. And I didn't say it was a continuation of service. I said it was an extension of service. Mr. Speaker, it was given to an affiliate, St. Joseph's, who have a long track record of providing health services in this province, long before the Saskatchewan Party government, under the previous government and governments before that. Mr. Speaker, that's a normal course of business. Why would we do an RFP for extension of medical services when an affiliate's already offering it? In Saskatoon, when we add services to St. Paul's Hospital, we don't first do an RFP or a tender for it. And I find it kind of surprising, Mr. Speaker, because the members opposite are always very concerned about any privatization that could possibly happen. And yet they're saying there should have been a tender instead of awarding it to the long-standing affiliate. Are the members suggesting it should have been tendered, and then that opens the possibility of it being awarded to the private sector? I'm curious the response.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, given to, handed to, sounds the same to me. Saskatchewan rehab centres have seen more than a 10-fold increase in admissions for people with crystal meth addictions, and our 2 major ERs saw an 860% increase in visits related to crystal meth since 2013-2014. This is an incredibly important initiative and one that we need to get right. Saskatchewan people need to be able to trust that this process was fair. The minister said this facility was initially supposed to open in July, but there isn't even a contract yet. How can we have Saskatchewan taxpayers funding this project when no contract exists?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
I'm not sure, Mr. Speaker, that the members understand that this is an affiliate with ongoing healthcare services in Estevan and area. Mr. Speaker, they operate the hospital there. They operate the long-term care facility there. They did under the previous government as well. Mr. Speaker, I'm just at a loss of their concern about this, Mr. Speaker. When we added the dialysis unit or the CT scan in Estevan, we didn't do a tender on it. Mr. Speaker, it's an affiliate that offers the services, much as the hospital in Humboldt and hospitals around the province, Mr. Speaker. I just find this whole thing somewhat strange. The members opposite love to bring up the name Grant Devine, yet this is Throwback Thursday, Mr. Speaker, but I think the member opposite, the leader of the opposition, was a day early yesterday, because in one question period he brought up the names Brad Wall, Grant Devine, Elwyn Hermanson, and Stephen Harper. Mr. Speaker, I understand that he would like to run against anyone except the current Premier, because I've seen the Angus Reid polls, Mr. Speaker. While we'd love to run against Dwayne Lingenfelter, we'd prefer to run against the current leader.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, this is very different from a CT scan, and we're talking about a for-profit company that's awarded $1.4 million in the budget this year. This deserves scrutiny. Yesterday, the minister tried to clarify the issue by saying that Grant Devine wasn't lobbying for an addiction centre in Estevan. He was in fact lobbying for rehab services in Saskatoon and Prince Albert. Excuse me, Mr. Speaker, can the minister elaborate on what Grant Devine is lobbying for? Because this work shows up nowhere in the lobbyist registry. Will it be, in Grant Devine's words, quote, a profitable business model that duplicates Cedar's model in BC? How is Cedars going to make money off this project, and how much?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, no, I can't, because I haven't spoken to Mr. Devine. I have no idea. I was surmising when I was chatting with the media that it seems to me that whatever projects he was talking about, it was not this one. I've talked to the CEO. He's assured me that that's the case. Mr. Speaker, I think what they're not understanding is the arrangement that the SHA has is with St. Joseph's, just as they do for all healthcare services in Estevan. Mr. Speaker, St. Joseph's, as I understood it, looked around, reached out on the advice of Dr. Wendy Gore-Hickman to Cedars to get some expertise from them, which I believe is going to be term limited, my understanding of it. But Mr. Speaker, maybe I can simplify this even more for the members opposite. It's very simple why that was a logical project to go to. Because those beds that are opening in Estevan, it took very little capital to get them ready, because they used to be addictions treatment beds, Mr. Speaker, until the NDP government in the 80s closed them down under their watch.
Here, here.
Sorry, recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Today, Saskatchewan's credit rating was downgraded. Can the Finance Minister share what impact this will have on our finances and the cost increase to accessing debt markets in both the short and long term?
Recognize the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, it was one credit agency that made a slight downgrade. We suspect they probably will do for several provinces because of the effect of COVID. However, we're still the second highest in all of Canada, so to date, that one credit agency won't affect our borrowing capacity, which is much stronger than other provinces within Canada. We entered this particular pandemic, Mr. Speaker, in a very strong position. We had a very strong cash position, which was important going in. We had corrected a structural problem within our budget so that we were in a balanced budget position prior to this shutdown of the economy, Mr. Speaker. We have among the lowest debt to GDP within the country, Mr. Speaker, which puts us in a very good position for our capacity to borrow, Mr. Speaker, and we have a very high credit rating, even with this slight downgrade. Mr. Speaker, it's disappointing, quite frankly, that the members opposite, day after day after day, demonstrate how they have absolutely no faith in this province. They have no faith that this province has what it takes to recover and grow the economy going forward.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Pretty straightforward question. A whole lot of anger over there, Mr. Speaker. But, you know, I guess it's rich coming from that finance minister who I guess has never balanced a budget. I guess never will either, Mr. Speaker. And this is a government that, of course, squandered the boom, that blew through the rainy day fund during some of the sunniest days in Saskatchewan's history. They failed to save a dime during those days. And in fact, they tripled the debt long before COVID-19 because of their endless stream of outsourced and mismanaged projects, from the Regina Bypass to the GTH to the carbon capture project and so many others. They didn't get the job done during the good times, and now all that's left for them is their tired old playbook, damaging cuts and sell-offs of our Crown corporations. Will the finance minister at least show some contrition and finally admit that the Sask Party's mismanagement during the good days left no fiscal cushion, left Saskatchewan vulnerable and exposed, and left Saskatchewan people paying the price?
Recognize the Minister of Finance.
Yeah. It's quite awesome that the member opposite doubled down on his lack of faith in the province and its ability to recover and grow the economy, Mr. Speaker. As I said in the last answer, should he be listening, we went into the pandemic in extremely strong fiscal position. It's recognized by the financial bankers, and if he goes back to estimates that we had the other night, I read many of those into the record of how they pointed out that we were in a strong position. I wonder how we're doing, and I'm hoping he checked today, of how we're doing in wholesale trade, the last statistics, Mr. Speaker. And how is that? In April 2020, it was up 1.6%, which was the highest in Canada because the Canadian average was a decline of 21.6%. Does that mean our province is in a bad position? No, I don't think it is, Mr. Speaker. We have some recovery and we have some work to do, but this province can do it, and this government will lead and facilitate that growth.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
So I'll be clear, our lack of faith is in that finance minister and that Sask Party government, Mr. Speaker. And it does a disservice to Saskatchewan people to gloss over the real recession, the deep recession that people are facing, and the thousands of jobs that people have lost. The fact is the Sask Party squandered the boom, and now they're bungling a recovery and leaving us in recession. Take the infrastructure dollars, for example, in this budget. There's no reason to believe that Saskatchewan workers will be put back to work in the way that they need and deserve to be. This might be a recovery plan for Kansas City or for Alberta's recovery or for France's recovery, because time and time again, the Sask Party outsources public projects and public dollars to out-of-country and out-of-province companies and workers. In fact, the only thing the budget commits to when it comes to jobs is that nearly 16,000 Saskatchewan people will lose theirs. Why won't the Sask Party commit at this important time to maximize our return on investment and implement a Saskatchewan First procurement plan to finally put Saskatchewan workers first, fire up our economy, and stop shutting out Saskatchewan workers and companies?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, again, the New Democrats are way behind. Mr. Speaker, back in 2014, we created Priority Saskatchewan as part of Sask Builds, Mr. Speaker, to do precisely that, to make sure that we maximize Saskatchewan content in Saskatchewan procurement, Mr. Speaker. And here's a number for the member opposite, Mr. Speaker. Over the last year, over 90% of procurement activity that's happened in Saskatchewan has gone to Saskatchewan companies, Mr. Speaker. Those companies are employing Saskatchewan workers, Mr. Speaker. Those workers are paying taxes in this province, Mr. Speaker. And I can commit to him, and I can commit to the people of Saskatchewan, that our officials at Priority Saskatchewan, with the support of this government, is going to continue to work to redouble our efforts to make sure that Saskatchewan people are working through the recovery, Mr. Speaker. $7.5 billion worth of infrastructure development by executive government and the Crowns over the next 2 years, Mr. Speaker. And Saskatchewan companies and Saskatchewan workers will be the beneficiaries of that work.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, the Sask Party government took a half step towards greater police oversight yesterday. These measures announced do not meet the standards for best practice in civilian oversight and still calls for police forces to investigate each other. Mr. Speaker, people in Saskatchewan deserve to have the highest standards for police oversight. That's important. Contrary to what the Minister for Policing and Corrections told media yesterday, who conducts the investigation does matter. It matters to families and it matters to the public. Does the Minister for Corrections and Policing agree that in 2020 people expect better and that it is time for an independent civilian-led organization to conduct serious investigations of police conduct?
Here, here.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have had, for over a decade in our province, have had a civilian-led institution, the Public Complaints Commission, which is led by a former judge and a number of other people, well-qualified, great credentials, somebody now a senator, to handle complaints against police officers. Mr. Speaker, we have that. We will continue to have that. What we've done in this budget is we've increased the funding for this to an excess of $1 million so that we're able to deal with those complaints in a more rigorous manner, provide better transparency and better oversight. Mr. Speaker, we've also included as part of the changes that we've made to have independent oversight on serious incidents that have taken place, which were previously done as a matter of handoff from one police agency to another. Those complaints will now be gone to the civilian-led Public Complaints Commission, who will work with other agencies, independent officers, people from elsewhere, to make sure that the processes are handled carefully, completely, and thoroughly in a manner that's acceptable to the public of this province.
Hear, hear.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. I recognize the chair of the Standing Committee on the Economy.
Mr. Speaker, I am instructed by the Standing Committee on the Economy to report Bill Number 181, the Mineral Taxation Modernization Amendment Act 2019, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered? Committee in the whole on bills. I recognize the minister.
Request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole, Mr. Speaker, on this bill, and that the bill be now read for the third time.
Minister has requested leave to waive consideration Committee of the Whole on Bill Number 181 and that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? The minister may proceed to move third reading.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It's been moved by the minister that Bill Number 181 be now read the third time, passed under its title. Assembly ready for the question. Pleasure to Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Recognize the chair of the Standing Committee on the Economy.
Mr. Speaker, I am instructed by the Standing Committee on the Economy to report Bill Number 179, the Apiaries Amendment Act 2019, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered? Committee in the whole on bills. I recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill be now read the third time.
Ministers requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill Number 179 and that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? The minister may proceed to move third reading.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the minister that Bill number 179 be now read third time and passed under its title. Assembly ready for the question. Pledge the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Orders of the day.
Second readings, item number 1, Bill number 209, the Saskatchewan Chemical Fertilizer Incentive Act. Honourable Mr. Harrison.
Recognize the Minister of Trade and Export Partnerships.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise for second reading of Bill 209, the Saskatchewan Chemical Fertilizer Incentive Act. And at the conclusion of my remarks, I will be moving second reading of that bill. Mr. Speaker, this is a part of our 2020 budget, as are the next 3 bills that will follow this as specified budget legislation. This bill, the SCFI for short, Saskatchewan Chemical Fertilizer Incentive, has the following features. Qualifying projects to receive a non-refundable CIT credit equal to 15% of eligible new capital expenditures upon commissioning of the facility. Qualifying projects include new or existing chemical fertilizer production facilities with eligible new capital expenditures of $10 million or more related to expanding productive capacity. The definition of eligible chemical fertilizer production being as follows: all processing of mineral or chemical feedstock to create a single or multi-nutrient synthetic fertilizer products, but does not include the manufacturing of potash fertilizer products for which potash is the primary feedstock. Projects must demonstrate the capital expenditures are made for the purpose of creating new productive capacity or increasing existing productive capacity. Redemptions of tax credits are limited to 20% in year 1, 30% in year 2, and 50% in year 3, with a maximum carry forward of 10 years on any remaining credit amount. Tax credits will not be transferable to a parent company or related entity, but it is transferable in the case of mergers and acquisitions. SCFI incentives will be incremental or complementary to existing incentives to ensure the entire competitiveness gap is closed, and the Ministry of Trade and Export Development will administer the program and convene an adjudication process that may include experts from other ministries. The Ministry of Finance will process tax rebates upon receipt of an eligibility certificate issued by TED, and the SCFI will sunset at the end of the 7th taxation year following proclamation. The objective, Mr. Speaker, being to attract new investment in the chemical fertilizer field. We feel that this is going to be a very important part of our growth going forward and our recovery going forward. And for this reason, Mr. Speaker, I do now move second reading of the Saskatchewan Chemical Fertilizer Incentive Act, Bill 209. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
It is moved that Bill number 209 be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question. I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Newtown.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise today to enter into some comments on the record in relation to this bill. And this bill, of course, as the Minister just explained, is in relation to incentives for the chemical fertilizer industry, and I believe to incent them to increase their construction either of new facilities or expansions of existing facilities, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, this is a bill that's near and dear to the Minister's heart and was in the original estimates that were prepared back in February, and certainly one that looks like he's very keen to have go through, Mr. Speaker. But we will have questions about it. He mentioned 7 years. I think we're going to have some questions about why this number was chosen in terms of the length of time of this incentive, and certainly we will have questions about the cost for taxpayers in terms of what revenues are being foregone by creating this incentive. There's a number of provisions in the Act that will deal with things like how to apply, how it'll be approved, how the application will be reviewed, and then how the certificates he mentioned will be issued, as well as how the tax credits will be claimed. He mentioned the Minister of Finance will be, her ministry will be responsible for the collection, the handling of the tax credits, and another of other types of clauses, including routine inspections, investigations, offences, penalties, immunity, and a number of regulatory provisions in Section 24 of this bill, Mr. Speaker. And so I think we'll have some questions on the Minister gave the opinion that this would increase the competitiveness of the chemical fertilizer industry here in Saskatchewan. We'll have questions on what sort of research was done to ensure that in fact this incentive will achieve the desired results that the Minister spoke about, and we look forward to having that discussion in committee, Mr. Speaker. So at this point, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 209, an act respecting the Saskatchewan Chemical Fertilizer Initiative.
The members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government order, second readings, item number 2. Bill number 210, the Income Tax Amendment Act 2020. Honourable Ms. Harpower.
Recognize the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I'm here today to move second reading of Bill number 210, the Income Tax Amendment Act 2020. This legislation implements the income tax initiatives announced on June 15, 2020 as part of the 2020-21 provincial budget. Mr. Speaker, the 2020-21 budget includes revenue initiatives to foster improved competitiveness and continued investment into the diversification of the province's economy while keeping taxes low and improving affordability for Saskatchewan people. I am pleased to announce the following 3 income tax initiatives in support of these objectives. First, beginning with the 2021 tax year, the provincial personal income tax system will once again be indexed to changes in the National Consumer Price Index. Indexation shields taxpayers from bracket creep or automatic increases in tax caused by inflation. Indexation preserves the real value of personal tax credits and income tax brackets, since these will increase with inflation. On a full-year basis, this change will reduce taxes for Saskatchewan taxpayers by an estimated $10 million each year. Second, this bill will allow for a tax deduction in respect of tax credits issued pursuant to the new Saskatchewan Chemical Fertilizer Incentive, SCFI Act. This incentive will provide a tax credit equal to 15% of the qualifying new capital expenditures relating to new or existing chemical fertilizer production facilities. And third, budget also announced a 3-year extension of the manufacturing and processing exporter tax incentive. The MNP exporter tax incentive was introduced in the 2015-16 budget to provide non-refundable tax credits to eligible corporations that expand the number of their MNP related full-time employees. Originally scheduled to end in 2019, the program will be extended by 3 years to the end of 2022. This initiative will continue to foster continued growth of a key sector of Saskatchewan's economy. Finally, Mr. Speaker, this legislation includes technical amendments that will simplify various provisions of the Act, clarify when a tax credit can be claimed under the Saskatchewan Technology Startup Incentive, add a reference to a new subsection in the Federal Income Tax Act that relates to the proof of electronic delivery, and to clarify in legislation the existing and long-standing practice of sharing taxpayer information with the Federal Department of Finance, who is our partner, along with the Canada Revenue Agency, in administering our income tax systems. Mr. Speaker, I now move second reading of Bill number 210, the Income Tax Amendment Act 2020.
It's been moved that Bill number 210 be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question. I recognize the member for Saskatoon, Newtana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And once again, it's my pleasure to be able to rise in the Assembly and address the legislative agenda of this government. And the particular bill we're discussing today is changes to the Income Tax Act that the Finance Minister just outlined in her comments. One thing I know about income tax is that I don't know a whole lot, Mr. Speaker. It's a very complex regime, and I remember in law school that was definitely the biggest text that any of us had was the income tax text. And I think it's kudos to the officials who manage all these complex clauses and issues and manage to make it work for the citizens of this province. I know indexation is something that this government has tried and then not tried, and now they're doing it again. Again, I'm not really sure I understand the reasons for that, and definitely that is our questions that we'll want to ask when we're in committee. So that's the main feature of this act. I believe, Mr. Speaker, and the Minister obviously referred to the new SCFI incentive, which will also be managed by changes to the Income Tax Act here in Saskatchewan. And then she talked about technical amendments to simplify and clarify the provisions of the Act. But, Mr. Speaker, I just have to share one of these simplifications and clarifications just to give you a sense of how not simple these sections are. So the new Section 17, Section 17 of the Income Tax Act is being repealed and replaced with this one, and it's the age credit clause. But here's how it reads, Mr. Speaker. For the purpose of computing the tax payable pursuant to this Act for the taxation years set 2017 through 2020 by an individual who, before the end of the taxation year, has attained the age of 65 years, there may be deducted an age credit in an amount, G, calculated in accordance with the following formula. G equals AP times TCA, where AP is the appropriate percentage for the taxation year, and TCA is bracket, parentheses, 4,894 minus B, parentheses, bracket, where B is 15% of the amount, if any, by which the individual's income for the year would exceed $36,430 if, in computing that income, A, no amount were included with respect to a gain from a disposition of property to which Section 79 of the Federal Act applies, and B, no amount were deducted pursuant to paragraph 20 sub 1 WW of the Federal Act. So there you go, Mr. Speaker. I really do want to pass on my congratulations to the officials who work in the Ministry of Finance for being able to understand that and apply it. And I'm sure once you dig into it, it makes sense. But, Mr. Speaker, I think this really speaks to the complexities of our income tax regime here in Saskatchewan. So if these are simplifying and clarifying, Mr. Speaker, I would really not want to see the previous clauses that were in place. But to that end, Mr. Speaker, these are complex issues, and I think the other thing the minister mentioned was the proof of electronic delivery is going to be accepted. Obviously, we're moving into a much more electronic world, and those types of modifications are necessary from time to time to ensure that our income tax regime is also modernized. And I know as a business owner, we file our PST, now we can do it all online. It's much simpler and much easier, and certainly appreciated in terms of the ease of filing. So these are important changes, Mr. Speaker. We will have many questions when this bill is brought to the committee, and so at this point, I think we're prepared to let it go to committee, Mr. Speaker.
Question before the Assembly's motion by the Minister that Bill number 210 be now read a second time. Pledge the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? I recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 210, the Income Tax Amendment Act 2020, be designated to the Committee on the Economy.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on the Economy.
Second readings, item number 3. Bill number 211, the Provincial Sales Tax Amendment Act 2020. Honourable Ms. Harpower.
Recognize the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to move second reading of Bill number 211, the Provincial Sales Tax Amendment Act 2020. This legislation implements amendments included in the 2020-21 provincial budget. Mr. Speaker, this bill will modernize the PST Act and strengthen the province's ability to ensure online retailers collect and remit provincial sales tax on sales in Saskatchewan. This in turn will help maintain a fair and level playing field for resident and non-resident businesses operating in Saskatchewan. The legislation includes technical amendment that will clarify the sale of taxable goods, services, accommodations, and contracts of insurance delivered, streamed, or accessed through an electronic distribution platform into Saskatchewan are taxable, and will require that businesses facilitating the purchase of goods and services within parties that are delivered and consumed in Saskatchewan are licensed as a vendor and collecting PST. Mr. Speaker, I now move second reading of Bill number 211, the Provincial Sales Tax Amendment Act 2020.
It's been moved that Bill number 211 be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question. I recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to be able to rise and enter into the debate on Bill number 211. As I mentioned in my previous speech, as a business owner, I have been able to file PST returns online now, and I know that one of the changes made back in the catastrophic 2017 budget was that retailers were no longer given a fee for collecting the tax for the government of Saskatchewan, and I think that has been a problem for retailers because they're basically helping the government out in a time when they certainly didn't have the resources to be able to do that without being recompensed, Mr. Speaker. So hopefully that these changes will help the amount of time that retailers are working for the government for free, and maybe reduce some of the onerous requirements for them to remit their the provincial sales tax that they collect. I believe that another aspect of this bill is dealing with non-residents and residents in terms of collecting taxes, and it brings to mind, Mr. Speaker, some of the large online platforms that are able to sell products on the internet that don't have to pay taxes or charge taxes and remit taxes on behalf of the purchasers for the people of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. As you know, this is a live issue, and hopefully I don't think this is going to address that issue, Mr. Speaker. It is something I think that the federal government is certainly responsible for as well, and we look to ensure that people, those large companies like Amazon, who are currently enjoying tax-free holiday, perhaps, is one way of putting it. I've seen other people describe Amazon and Airbnb and some of those larger platforms as the robber barons of the 21st century, Mr. Speaker, because they entered in a space where there weren't tax regimes in place. So I think we're a bit behind the ball on that one, Mr. Speaker. But at any rate, again, this is a complex act, the Provincial Sales Tax Act, and these changes, I believe, are attempting to modernize and certainly facilitate the collection of taxes, which is always something that should be looked for, Mr. Speaker. So at this point, that's the extent of my comments on Bill number 211, an act to amend the Provincial Sales Tax Act.
Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
Oh, to which committee shall that, to which committee will this bill be committed?
I recognized.
Recognize the Deputy House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 211, the Provincial Sales Tax Amendment Act, be designated to the Committee of the Crown and Central Agencies.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee and Crown and Central Agencies. Why is the Deputy Government House Leader on his feet?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask leave to rescind the order for the committal of Bill number 210 to the Standing Committee on the Economy, and the said bill be committed to the Standing Committee of Crown and Central Agencies.
The Deputy Government House Leader has asked leave to change up a couple bills, the two committees. Is the 210, Bill 210, is leave granted? Carried. Yeah. This bill 210 stands committed to the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies.
Okay, second readings, item number 4, Bill number 212, the Police Amendment Act 2020. Honourable Mr. Morgan.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move second reading of the Police Amendment Act 2020. Transparency and accountability with respect to the oversight of policing in the province has never been more important. This is particularly true with respect to serious incidents where the actions of a police officer result in serious injury or death of an individual. Mr. Speaker, our government takes these matters very seriously and has committed to examining the issue of police oversight. This bill contains numerous enhancements to the oversight of policing in our province and builds on the province's existing investigation observer model by creating further independence when overseeing the investigation of policing activities. These changes represent government's initial response to public concerns and form part of our ongoing commitment to reviewing this matter. Mr. Speaker, the Act currently contains a process to appoint investigation observers to oversee investigations in incidents where a person has been seriously injured or died while in the custody of a police service or as a result of the actions of a police officer. The first set of changes will enhance the investigation observer process by firstly transferring administration of investigation observers to the Public Complaints Commission, or the PCC, expanding the instances where investigation observers are appointed to include sexual assaults and off-duty incidents involving police officers, expanding the persons who can be appointed as investigation officers beyond current and retired police officers, requiring the appointment of 2 investigation observers, one of whom must be of First Nations or Métis ancestry, where the victim is of First Nations or Métis ancestry. And finally, requiring the chair of the PCC to publish a summary of investigation observer reports. Mr. Speaker, the proposed changes are an important and timely step to enhance civilian-led policing oversight in Saskatchewan. The second set of changes will implement a new complaint and review process through the PCC for members and staff of police services who experience workplace harassment. Mr. Speaker, the issue of harassment within police services has received considerable attention from the media and public in recent years. The government is sensitive to that fact and believes it is important to be proactive in providing a neutral, third-party review process for members and staff that face any forms of alleged harassment. Saskatchewan will be the first province in Canada to implement this type of harassment review process within the legislation and is committed to taking a lead role with this matter. The third set of changes will implement a new review process through the PCC respecting public complaints for prescribed classes of special constables, including conservation officers and highway traffic officers. The implementation of the Saskatchewan Protection and Response Team has resulted in an expansion of responsibilities for conservation officers and highway traffic officers. The proposed provisions will enhance the public complaint process respecting these officers. Additionally, the proposed changes will add regulation-making authorities respecting special constables. This is an administrative change that will allow for future uniform regulations to clarify rules for special constables. The 2021 provincial budget will provide additional funding to the PCC to ensure it has the appropriate staff and resources to take on the new responsibilities under this bill, in addition to the important work the PCC already carries out. Mr. Speaker, the government believes in accountability and integrity of the Saskatchewan police forces and is grateful for the important work carried out by police officers and special constables. However, it is also important to ensure that we maintain strong civilian oversight of policing activities. These amendments will allow us to promote and require that policing be fair and effective for everyone in Saskatchewan. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to move second reading of the Police Amendment Act 2020.
It has been moved that Bill number 212 be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question. I recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtowner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's, again, an honour to be able to rise in this Assembly and speak to the bill that the Minister just gave his second reading on. Confidence in our police system is more important today than it ever has been, Mr. Speaker. With the results that we see unfolding across the globe when it comes to Black Lives Matter, when it comes to police brutality and some of the terrifying events that we've seen occur, this is an important time for not only the people of Saskatchewan, but the people around the world. This bill, as far as I know, was pretty much drafted and ready to go 3 months ago, and much has changed since then, Mr. Speaker, and I feel that this government is missing an opportunity to react to some of the things that have come out in more recent times. And we see a number of states changing how police forces are funded, and certainly I think police oversight is more critical to confidence in our police force than ever, Mr. Speaker. I always rest assured in my home in Saskatoon that when I go to sleep at night, that I know there are people out there looking out for the safety of our community, and that makes me sleep better, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure it does for many of us. However, we know that for some individuals, that's not always the case. When people are being stopped because of the color of their skin, Mr. Speaker, or excessive police force is being applied because of circumstances like we saw with the chief in Northern Alberta, those are the kinds of things I think that these types of oversight committees are designed to bring forth, to clarify, to bring fresh air and transparency to police force actions. And I think there is definitely a missed opportunity here, Mr. Speaker, in terms of this bill. Today, the Mayor of Saskatoon issued a statement and talked about some motions that they're going to bring in the Saskatoon City Council. This is an article called Next Steps in Strengthening Police Oversight and Building Community Safety and Well-Being. And His Worship Mayor Clark talked about this provincial government initiative, and he had the following to say in terms of the police complaints and accountability processes. And I'll quote from his article. He said, quote, "Yesterday the provincial government announced the first steps of reform to Saskatchewan's police oversight system. These steps are important for reducing the backlog in complaints and improving the transparency of the complaints process. The reality is that even with these reforms, we remain behind other provinces. We still have the practice of police investigating police in serious incident investigations. 7 provinces have implemented serious incident response teams to replace the practice of police investigating police. Saskatchewan moving to a more independent process is something that is supported by police services, First Nations leaders and human rights advocates alike as a way to improve the independence of the process." Mr. Speaker, so I think the backlog in complaints, the minister briefly alluded to additional funds to support the commission. This is a huge backlog, if I understand correctly, and I believe that those funds will go a long ways to reducing the backlog, but certainly you can't have trust in a process if you can't have your complaint heard. So fingers crossed that these funds will deal with that issue. And of course, the idea of police investigating police has not been dealt with in this bill. I think, again, given what we've seen across the globe, south of the border, and even in our own province, Mr. Speaker, and other provinces where excessive force is being used on individuals, those are cases, I think, that need to have that transparency and accountability. And I know many of the members of our forces want to see that as well. Certainly the mayor alluded to that with, in his article. And I think the police are doing such incredible, valuable work for the citizens here in Saskatchewan and across the board. And we want to be proud of them, they want to be proud of themselves. And so as long as we have those systems that allow them to be proud of the work they do and to deal with those serious incidents which can cause so much strife, Mr. Speaker, it's concerning that the government didn't take an opportunity at this point in time to take a second look at this draft bill. They had a few months to do that, and unfortunately, I don't think it goes far enough. So at this point, I will end my comments on Bill number 212, the Police Amendment Act 2020.
It's a pleasure, Assembly, to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
Recognize the Minister of Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would designate that this bill be referred to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 1, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 197, the Automobile Accident Insurance Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Rancourt.
Recognize a member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising to speak to Bill number 197. I've already had the opportunity to make comments on the record on this bill, as have a number of my colleagues. So I think at this point we'll look to see what questions will come up in committee, and that will be the extent of our comments in the Assembly.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure, Assembly, to adopt the motion? No. All right, question before the Assembly is motion on, which number are we at? 197. Pleasure, Assembly, to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
Which committee shall this bill stand committed? Recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 197, the Automobile Accident Insurance Act 2019, be designated to the Committee on Crown and Central Agencies.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 2, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 198, the Traffic Safety Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Vermette.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Again, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are nearing the end of adjourned debates, and on this bill in particular, as I've already had an opportunity to make comments, simply today I want to just get on the record that we are looking forward to an extensive overview in committee, and as such, that is the extent of any further comments in this Assembly on Bill number 198.
Question before the Assembly is committal on, what number are we at? 198. Pleasure the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
Recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 198, the Traffic Safety Amendment Act 2019, be designated to the Committee on Crown and Central Agencies.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 3, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 199, the Opioid Damages and Health Care Cost Recovery Act. Mr. Witherspoon.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, pleased to be able to rise. There was a time there in March where I never knew if I'd get up in this Assembly again, but today I'm up quite a bit. This is the Opioid Damages Healthcare Cost Recovery Act. We have had some opportunity to make comment here in the House since the bill was introduced, and we are looking forward to a careful examination of the bill by our critic in committee, and therefore that will conclude the comments here in the Assembly on this Bill number 199.
Question before the Assembly is Bill number 199. Will the Assembly adopt the motion? Agreed. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
Recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 199, the Opioid Damages and Healthcare Cost Recovery Act, be designated to the Committee on Human Services.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Human Services.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 4. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 201, the Alcohol and Gaming Regulation Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Beck.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Newtana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Having had the opportunity to speak to this bill previously, I just want to add to the record that this will conclude our comments in the Assembly on this bill, but we look forward to an opportunity to ask questions in committee of the officials and to get a better sense of some of the technical details of the bill. So that will conclude our comments on Bill number 201, an act to amend the Alcohol and Gaming Regulation Act 1997.
Question for the Assembly is the second reading motion of Bill number 201. Pledge Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
Recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 201, the Alcohol and Gaming Regulations Amendment Act 2019, be designated to the Committee on Crown and Central Agencies.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 5, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 203, the Financial Planners and Financial Advisors Act. Mr. Vermette.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon-Newtana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising to speak to Bill number 203, and just would have the following to say that this is definitely a bill that brings some changes to definitions and authorizes the Financial and Consumer Affairs Authority to approve credentialing bodies, sets out conditions for suspension or revocation of those bodies, and the duties and powers of the bodies. Also for inspection and investigations of the activities of financial planners and advisors. So this is important legislation, Mr. Speaker, and certainly one that we look forward to asking questions in committee on. So I think at this point, that would be the extent of my comments on Bill number 203, an act respecting financial planners and financial advisors and making consequential amendments to another act.
Before the Assembly, second reading motion, Bill number 203. Pledge the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
Recognize Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 203, the Financial Planners and Financial Advisors Act, be designated to the Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 6, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 204, the Jury Amendment Act 2019. Mr. McCall.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this is it. This is my final bill to speak to in this Assembly before the next legislature begins. And so I'm not sure if the opposition have some comments or the government has some comments to make about that, Mr. Speaker. But it has been an absolute privilege to be able to address the Assembly in these bills and the agenda of this government, and an honor, Mr. Speaker, to represent the people of Saskatoon-Newtana in this fashion. I have had an opportunity to get comments on the record previously on Bill number 204. Our very capable justice critic will be able to follow up in committee with some detailed questions of the officials, but just at this point, I just want to reiterate what an honor it's been to be in this assembly and have these opportunities to share some of my thoughts on the legislative agenda of this government. So that will conclude my comments on Bill number 204, an act to amend the Jury Act 1998.
Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 204 be now read a second time. Pleasure the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? I recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 204, the Jury Amendment Act 2019, be designated to the Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice. Recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In order to facilitate the Committee of Works, I move that this House do now adjourn.
Deputy Government House Leader has moved that this Assembly now adjourn. Please Assembly to adopt that motion. Carried. This Assembly stands adjourned until tomorrow at 10 a.m.